1, 2, 3, 4. Reading, writing, analyzing texts. They're the skills that can bring you to the top. It's AP Lang and Pop. Good morning, folks. I hope you're all well and that you're enjoying our course theme song. I'd encourage those of you who are musically inclined, John Calix, Ayuki, others, I'm talking about you all, to come up with an alternative jingle for our class. When you finish your other major assignments, don't do that now, but we'll stick with this one for now. I hope you get a kick out of it. The objective of the video this morning is to talk about how to identify syntax that matters when you're doing a rhetorical analysis. So this video should help you with the assignment that's due this week on Thursday evening. The motivation for this session is that I've noticed when reviewing students' rhetorical analyses, some of you, many of you seem uncertain about when syntax is notable, and this is a tricky thing. Sometimes, people will identify passages and they'll just say, well, the author's use of commas or punctuation of a certain type matters, when in fact the examples they've chosen really aren't best. And so this takes a little practice. Not all sentences are created equal. Sometimes commas are just commas. Sometimes they're not worth analyzing. So you can't just kind of like open to a page, pick some aspect of sentence structure and make a compelling argument. So what I'm going to propose, and then I'll share a couple of examples with you, is that the strategy you use is to find syntax that is clearly connected to purpose. What do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look. So the first passage that we're going to look at, the non-exemplar, where I don't think syntax is notable, is from page 12. So it's early in the book where J.D. Vance is talking about his family and life in Kentucky. So if you look at the paragraph here on page 12, he says, "My grandparents left Jackson in the late 1940s and raised their family in Middletown, Ohio, where I later grew up. But until I was 12, I spent my summers and much of the rest of my time back in Jackson. I'd visit along with Mama, who wanted to see friends and family, ever conscious that time was shortening the list of her favorite people. And as time wore on, we made our trips for one reason above all, to take care of Mama's mother, whom we called Mama Blanton, to distinguish her, though somewhat confusingly, from Mama." So I'll pause there. As you can see in this paragraph, there's plenty of punctuation, complex sentence structure, commas, a colon, a portion of a sentence that's in parentheses. But this is an example where that punctuation is just for clarity. I don't see those syntactical choices of J.D. Vance as being particularly notable or tied to something central about his purpose. So I do not think this would be good evidence to choose for analysis. On the very next page, however, Vance starts comparing life in Kentucky to life in Ohio because he's setting up this theme about the difficulty of the transition to Ohio for his family, and then specifically the difficulties he encountered in his life in Ohio. Even more specifically, the challenge that living in a home where he was exposed to like rotating father figures, all of the fleeting relationships that his mother had. That's what he's moving in the direction of, and we'll see the following two examples I think really do illustrate syntax that is connected to purpose. Vance is going to set this theme up on page 13, where he writes, "At a deep level, Jackson was the one place that belonged to me, my sister, and Mama. I loved Ohio, but was full of painful memories." Then he's going to expand on this in the next paragraph, where he begins to compare and contrast Ohio with Kentucky. He writes, "In Ohio, I had grown especially skillful at navigating various father figures." Now listen to the way Vance constructs these sentences and look at how he uses syntax here. "With Steve, a midlife crisis sufferer with an earring to prove it, I pretended earrings were cool, so much so that he thought it appropriate to pierce my ear too. With Chip, an alcoholic police officer who saw my earring as a sign of girliness, I had thick skin and loved police cars. With Ken, an odd man who proposed to Mom 3 days into their relationship, I was a kind brother to his 2 children. But none of these things was really true. I hated earrings, I hated police cars, and I knew that Ken's children would be out of my life by the next year. In Kentucky, I didn't have to pretend to be someone I wasn't, because the only men in my life, my grandparents' brothers and brothers-in-law, already knew me. Did I want to make them proud? Of course I did, but not because I pretended to like them. I genuinely loved them. I think this is a great use of syntax. From the very first sentence in the paragraph, you see Vance is setting up a contrast between Ohio and Kentucky. So he begins in Ohio, comma, I'd grown especially skillful at navigating various father figures. Boom, that's what we know is going to define the rest of this paragraph about his struggle to adapt to this household. And then we see the payoff to this. Vance mirrors the same structure of that sentence later on towards the end of the paragraph, second to last sentence. In Kentucky, I didn't have to pretend to be someone I wasn't because the only men in my life, right? So here's the contrast, and the way Vance clarifies this is with the kind of parallel sentence structure. In Ohio, it was like this. In Kentucky, by comparison, it was like this. Then look internally. This is where I think the paragraph is really cool. Vance uses the same structure sentence after sentence to set up and underscore the challenges of all these people who were rotating through as his father figures. We've got Steve, a midlife crisis sufferer, and then with Steve, Vance has to behave a certain way. So he uses this repeating parallel sentence structure with person X, some description of how, challenging this person was given the personal quirks, followed by an explanation of how, or a depiction of how Vance had to behave with this person. We mirror that 3 times with Steve, with Chip, with Ken, and then we've got this short, abrupt sentence, but none of those things were really true. And now look, he goes through that same structure of looking at his behavior with a sentence that has 3 parts about how he really felt about the way he had to act with these men. I hated earrings, I hated police cars, and I knew that Ken's children would be out of my life by the next year. So this is really, I think, I would argue, artfully constructed paragraph where Vance's use of syntax sets up contrasts between Ohio, where he felt very conflicted and challenged, and Kentucky, where he didn't feel that way. Vance picks up on this theme and develops throughout the book. One way we can tell is if we jump from page 13 to page 150, much later in the book, we're back on that same theme, but now Vance is talking more about the effect that this instability had on him, and he does so again using some really effective syntax. The next example I want to look at comes from page 150. In this passage, Vance is back in Ohio, but the contrast he's going to set up is between his home life when he's living with his mother and his home life when he later in high school starts living with his grandmother. So in this paragraph you're looking at now, Vance says, I know Mama was good for me not because some Harvard psychologist says so, but because I felt it. Consider my life before I moved in with Mama. Now pay attention to the syntax here. In the middle of 3rd grade, we left Middletown and my grandparents to live in Preble County with Bob. At the end of 4th grade, we left Preble County to live in a Middletown complex on the 200 block of McKinley Street. At the end of 5th grade, we left the 200 block of McKinley Street to move to the 300 block of McKinley Street. By that time, Chip was a regular in our home, though he'd never lived with us. At the end of 6th grade, we remained on the 300 block of McKinley Street, but Chip had to be replaced by Steve, and there were many discussions about moving in with Steve. At the end of 7th grade, Matt had taken Steve's place. Mom was preparing to move in with Matt, and Mom hoped that I would join her in Dayton. At the end of 8th grade, she demanded that I move to Dayton, and after a brief detour at my dad's house, I acquiesced. At the end of 9th grade, I moved in with Ken, a complete stranger, and his 3 kids. On top of all that, there were drugs, the domestic violence case, children's services prying into our lives, and Papa dying. Okay, monster paragraph there. definite choices of syntax. Vance has strung all of these sentences together in one long sentence, separated with semicolons, and he repeats, if you notice, every time he's talking about a transition, it's from this to this, then from this to that, and he keeps on going here. He's inserting all sorts of like parenthetical asides about the men, um, using setting off those points in parentheses. All of this, I would argue, is to underscore the chaos and uncertainty. He's made this big jumble of a paragraph to emulate the big jumble of his life at the time. So I want to look at one more with you. If you go over on page 151, look at this paragraph that begins, "Now consider the sum of my life after I moved in with Mamaw permanently. At the end of 10th grade, I lived with Mamaw in her house with no one else. Period. At the end of 11th grade, I lived with Mamaw in her house with no one else. Period. At the end of 12th grade, I lived with Mamaw in her house with no one else. I could say that the peace of Mamaw's home gave me a safe space to do my homework. I could say that the absence of fighting and instability let me focus on school and my job. I could say that spending all of my time in the same house with the same person made it easier for me to form lasting relationships with people at school. I could say that having a job and learning a bit about the world helped clarify precisely what I wanted out of my own life. In hindsight, those explanations make sense, and I'm certain that a bit of truth lies in each." So again, I would argue that these are very deliberate choices of how a writer is using syntax to compare and contrast the disjointedness and chaos and trauma of one situation, Vance's experience living with his mother, and a very ordered, calm, predictable experience living with Mamaw. And look at how the syntax creates that order. For one, instead of jamming all the sentences together into one long sentence that you have to read without pause. The sentences in this paragraph are separated by periods, so you pause. And there's a greater sense of calm and peace when you do that. Furthermore, the repetition of "I live with Mama in her house with no one else" again and again, he really drives that point home. And then using a similar structure of sentences at the end of the paragraph, he talks about all of the things that benefited from that process. So this got a little bit longer than I'd intended, but I hope you found it helpful. Again, I think the big takeaway is that not all sentences are created equal. You can't just point your finger to a sentence in a paragraph and say that the punctuation matters or that the syntax is deliberate. Use the connection of the syntax to a part of an author's central purpose or argument as your guide for what matters and what doesn't. That is the single biggest takeaway. I'm going to try to keep these videos down, cut these videos down to about 5 minutes. Tomorrow's will focus on how to get the 1 point for the thesis statement. And then Thursdays we'll focus on writing claims. We need to break people of the habit of saying the author uses syntax or diction or whatever it is we're analyzing. So please come back and stay tuned for those. Have a great day. Stay healthy, stay safe, take care, and be in touch if I can help support your learning. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.